All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dave Bader. I'm the Director of Education here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody that we are live tonight. We're streaming. So if you have your cell phones and whatnot, we'd love you to put those on mute, turn those off for the duration of our event tonight. And thank you. So first, I also want to make sure that we acknowledge our sponsors for this, the Gazette newspapers and Courtyard Marriott. Without them, we couldn't make these possible for everybody and bring the fabulous speakers that we have throughout the year, including Al George, who I'm going to introduce you to tonight. So Albert George here from the South Carolina Aquarium is going to talk to us about how we can prepare our communities for the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. George is the Director of Conservation at the South Carolina Aquarium. He's also the co-founder of the Amazon Reforestation Project. He earned a bachelor's degree in marine biology and chemistry and a study at Yale and Harvard, earning a master's degree at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He previously served as the Director of Education at the Georgia Aquarium, and in our conversations today, he's also been working towards making that connection between communities and green technologies, green energies, and thinking more broadly about how we need to connect ourselves within the communities, sort of at that grassroots level, to make sure that a lot of the major changes that we need to see happening, especially with climate resilience, have that voice of public support. And in the last 3 years at the South Carolina Aquarium, he's been able to do that. He's going to tell us a little bit about that tonight. So, Al, come on up.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to get the disclaimers out ahead of time. First and foremost, thank you for the gracious invitation to join you tonight. What an honor and a privilege to be here. Secondly, I would say in terms of disclaimers, I'm very passionate about this topic, so don't be afraid if my voice actually elevates in terms of pitch and tone, because as I tell Dave over lunch and over dinner, we're fighting for home. And if that's not something that you can't get passionate about, I don't know what's sort of in you at that point. And then lastly, I want to just wish you guys a happy 20th. I've been enjoying sort of seeing all of the 20th anniversary hats, logos, and the swag. We're like 2 years behind you guys, so I want you to know I've been like looking at ideas about swag packages, and in full disclosure, South Carolina Aquarium, I have a whole line of notes on how we're going to infuse our 20th anniversary. I also like to begin my presentation with a thank you of my teammates. I celebrated my 3-year anniversary with the South Carolina Aquarium on June 1st. And my task was to stand up a brand new conservation department. And it's been a great journey, but I haven't been able to do this on my own. And so I want to thank my conservation department teammates, Kelly Thorvison, who serves as our conservation programs manager, Christy Hughes, who serves as our conservation and research administrator, and Andrea Maggiata, who serves as our good catch coordinator. They have been willing to basically embrace the challenge along with me. And so a lot of the work that I present tonight is not just me standing on my own, but basically standing with this wonderful team. On the actual topic, the resilience imperative. And basically, I say it's an imperative because we're beyond the point where we can opt in or opt out. When you think about that, we have potentially 6 to 11 feet of sea level rise that's being projected over the next 85 years. In a place called the Low Country, you can imagine that could have some potential implications. And so as we walk through this presentation tonight, it's my simple hope that we can just have a conversation. I can share with you sort of our journey over the last 3 years to try to engage these topics in a meaningful way, and not only engage the topics, but come up with a thought process for how do we sort of have a vision and a strategy for how we move forward. So, as many of you may or may not know, at the South Carolina Aquarium, we are known for our sea turtle care, our sea turtle hospital. And one of the things I told Kevin when he was interviewing me for the job is that there are looming issues for sea turtles beyond just boat strikes and beyond just sort of things that we would sort of just think of. And believe it or not, some of the looming threats that you may or may not think of as it relates to sea turtle care is in relation to 2 critical issues. One being sea level rise, which basically is, as we would see through some parts of this presentation, has critical implications for habitat. The other being the rise of marine aquatic plastic, which I do know that a lot of us have been elevating the issue of plastic, but in particular, we've seen a pronounced increase in the amount of sea turtles that have been impacted by plastic ingestion over the last 2 years in particular. And one of the things I tell people about the sea turtles that we take care of inside of our hospital is that we only get the sea turtles that's lucky enough to arrive at our facility. You know, basically, we have an army of volunteers that work in collaboration with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources to identify those sea turtles that wash up debilitated, or that are found floating in the water. And basically, we only get the ones that's lucky. But for us to have this 75% increase in the number of sea turtles that's being impacted by this phenomenon of plastic, to me is just canary, literally a canary in the mine. But oftentimes when we think about the biome, and one of the things that I talk a lot about in my recent dialogue with different groups such as this, is that in olden times, when you talk about conservation, it was small C conservation. And what I mean small C conservation, you mostly talk about biome, bioprotection, biodiversity protection. But in this current day of conservation, what's right behind the sand dunes? What's right behind the salt marshes? Human habitat. And so one of the things that I tell people in this new era of conservation, in this new era, guess what? Whether we want to admit it or not, human habitats are just as a part of this equation as the biome protection, as the endangered species protection, as the other things that we traditionally consider to be traditional conservation. In this new era of conservation, big C conservation, human habitat is just as important. And the picture that you have here is actually a picture of Charleston. And Charleston is interesting. Not only does it have this great history and this great beauty, but Charleston has something called nuisance flooding, where basically we have had over the last 2 years, we have broken our records of what we call sunny day flooding, where literally you would have downtown Charleston flooded, not by rain, but through tidal cycles. So 2 years ago, we broke our record of having 38 days without rain, flooded without rain. Last year, I think we had 50 days of flooding without rain, which basically just become more the norm. And I think the projections show that if we continue on this current path, we can potentially have 180 days of flooding without rain on the Charleston Peninsula if the projections are correct. And so one of the things that when we first began sort of this process, I'm a data guy, we wanted to assess what was the current base of the data. And so when you look at the data, basically the data from the 2014 National Climate Assessment Report, the gray area was pretty much at the time what was believed to be the trend. Basically, through that assessment, which is a compilation of a lot of federal agencies sort of coming together to sort of look at where the trend could lead to, the gray area in terms of the dark gray was basically where we thought we could see sort of the sea level rise scenario by the end of this century, by 2100. Unfortunately, given the latest updates, I've seen data that would suggest that the light gray area is now more of the likely sort of reality. So instead of us looking at a potential 4 feet of sea level rise by 2100, there is a high potential that that is no longer the area where we're most concerned with it. That is actually more towards a 6 foot of sea level rise scenario that we would need to be concerned with, would need to have an eye towards as a part of this thought process. And then in addition to that, we've also had different groups like Climate Central, and this is kind of like an irony. I was actually looking at this data as we begun the process, and so this, quick orientation, the blue is basically the threat of flooding, under steady circumstances. The red is basically the threat of flooding as it relates to a potential sea level rise impact. And when you look at it, Savannah had an 83%. Charleston, was definitely ranking, relatively moderate. Myrtle Beach had a high percentage. Cape Fear had a high percentage. Unfortunately, this was done in 2014, and I would say that unfortunately, because this research report became very prophetic. Over the last since this report has been published, we've had major flood inundation events, at least 3 cycles of flood inundation events in Charleston alone. In 2015, due to the rain bomb, 2016 due to Matthew, and 2017 due to Irma. And basically, when you think about Savannah, this was Savannah as a result of Hurricane Matthew. The lady who's depicted in this photo, her name is Valerie. And Valerie is basically on East President Street in Savannah trying to make her way from a homeless encampment. And I don't know about you, but something about this picture, when I watched it, and which I saw this picture, I grew up in the city of Savannah, it moved me. And it made me think about those fundamental questions of, we think about sea level rise, we think about climate change, and a lot of times we talk about it in very lofty terms, but what about the people? Not just about the affluent people, what about the people who live in homeless encampments? What about those people who live on the marginal islands? And what about the people who are the underserved or minority groups who can't afford sort of rapid adaptation and mitigation related strategies? And so with that thought process in mind, we created the Resilience Initiative for Coastal Education. And the Rice Initiative was an inspired initiative, and I have two things of orientation I just want to walk through right quick. When we decided that we wanted to launch this new initiative, I was concerned that basically if we were just using status quo related strategies of just going to talk science at people, to maybe the science wouldn't necessarily translate, meaning as scientists sometimes we're not the best communicators of data in a way that would engage people in a warm and fuzzy way. And so one of the things that I thought about from the beginning and that I asked now soon become a world-renowned artist by the name of Sonia Evans, I asked her, would she be willing to put together a representation from an art perspective that would embody this Gullah Geechee culture, that could serve as something that could anchor and connect people to this topic. And basically, the whole notion of this sort of caricature, which is called American Gullah, and it's a play off American Gothic, is how do we help people understand that large-scale water land engineering is not new to South Carolina and Georgia. That it's not new to South Carolina and Georgia. And so you'll hear me elaborate more on that. And then the second thing that you see over to my far left and to your right is a marker or it's a moniker for the Gadsden Wharf area. And I don't know how many of you actually had a chance to travel to Charleston, but basically the land where the aquarium sits on is called Gadsden's Wharf. And Gadsden's Wharf is known to be the largest port of deportation of slaves from the mid-Atlantic slave trade in the entire United States of America. So basically, to put it in a nutshell, that's our Ellis Island. 70 to 80% of the people who call themselves African American in this country, one of their ancestors or both of their ancestors took their first step at that site. And so one of the things that I wanted to do as a part of our initiative is how do we not only embrace the cultural heritage and history of our sort of native part of the world, but how in that embrace, how do we get people to connect with this issue in a meaningful and in a different way? And so the key thing that I wanted to show here, and I wanted just to walk the dog a little bit on this history, is that in this part of the world, I know a lot of times when people think about slave and they think about production crops that came from slavery, you think about cotton. But from Georgetown down to Savannah, it was rice. Rice production was the basis of the importation of the West African slave who came in. And the reason why I draw a specific point of emphasis on that is that that was a critical issue because they were not just recruiting these people from West Africa because of their brawn. They were recruiting these people because they were large-scale waterland engineers. They were large-scale waterland engineers that have been doing large-scale rice plantation production in collaboration with the Dutch and many other people for thousands of years. And so the critical point that I wanted to try to raise with this is that the whole notion of the rice plantation structure, it is documented how it literally changed the entire face of the South Carolina and Georgia basin. It really reorganized the entire land base. It's estimated that basically through the rise of the plantation structure, that basically those West African slaves that are now known as Gullah Geechee moved more land in that sort of large-scale aggregation, large-scale land-water aggregation endeavor than the amount of stone that it took to actually build the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Now, the problem is this is not very well-known history, and even among the Gullah Geechee people, they may not even understand their own heritage and history, that when you see a person like myself who's an African-American marine biologist, I tell people all the time, this is should not be anything that surprises you. This is a part of my cultural identity as a person who was recruited here to do this type of work through my ancestors. But I just want to give you a sense of sort of from Georgetown to Savannah. That's where the rice plantation production was done, and primarily this is where a lot of the Gullah Geechee people still live. So, with that being said, we wanted to launch an initiative that would allow us to take this message and create these two-way flows of communication with communities that have been traditionally not a part of this equation. And a key part of this effort has been, how do we then not expect these communities to come to us, but how do we then establish these rapport with these communities for us to then do this work? And so we had the privilege of starting off with St. Helena, which that was in May 14, 2016. That was actually at the Penn Center. The Penn Center was the first school created in the South, basically, for ex-slaves, while the Civil War was still going on. So this is hallowed ground. We then ventured on to Charleston, South Carolina, July 2016, which was great. We did Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, in August 27, 2016. We initially had Savannah scheduled for October 2016, but something by the name of Hurricane Matthew happened, which we had to reschedule that, and so it actually fell in January 2018, 2017. And then we did Hilton at Allen, South Carolina, in April 20th, 2017. And basically, our partners were the Medical University of South Carolina, because as we discussed over dinner tonight, a big part of the climate change equation is not just about what would be the biome-related inferences, but also the health-related impacts through zoonotics, through vector-borne diseases, through other things that we don't even have not yet discussed. We also had another partner through SETV, which actually filmed all of these different documentaries and filmed all of these different town halls. We also had an Allen University that basically has an environmental justice component. Allen University is a minority serving institution that has an environmental justice component as a part of their curriculum. And basically, that we wanted to have baked into our process at the beginning a frame of reference for how do we communicate and establish these rapports with these legacy communities or these untraditional communities or these communities that have not traditionally been a part of this discussion. I mentioned that we actually created a documentary that was called Sea Change by SETV. Now that's being distributed through National ETV. We just found out 2 weeks ago that we actually won the award, the 2018 Telly Award for that Sea Change documentary. So that was very exciting. But last but not least, we also created 4 site-specific documentaries, which we're now in the process of going back to these communities and basically fulfilling the promise that not only were we going to come to your community, not only were we going to ask you to answer questions, but we were going to come back to you with a finished product and basically show you the distillation of what we were able to sort of hear from your community through the site-specific documentaries. And this right here is an example, and I guess it's a little bit dark, but basically this is a depiction of the Hilton Head Forum. You have Kevin Mills, our CEO, actually presenting as a part of this forum. And what you see there is the sea rise related application. A big part of what we were trying to achieve was not only how do you engage people directly where they live, but also how do you give them tools. When you start talking about 6 feet of sea level rise, how does that personally, we wanted people to be able to contextualize that. How do you understand what does that mean for you personally, the street that you live on? How do you contextualize that from the standpoint of what does that mean for my community? What does that mean for my family, my potential city, my neighbors? And so a critical part of what we wanted to do here is to give people not only sort of the frame of reference of what is going on, but also the frame of reference of a utilization of a tool that could give them a better understanding of how it can impact them directly. And within this, let's go back one. And in addition to the tool, or in addition to having something where they can have a frame of reference, a key part of this that we wanted to promote is the notion of people becoming citizen science. And so what you see here is one example of what we call the Litter-Free Digital Journal, which I get into greater detail. This is a specific citizen science application that allows people to chronicle or to reference aquatic debris that basically is occurring in their own local neighborhoods or throughout the entire state. We also wanted to do a specific sea rise application, which people could then chronicleize their own citizen science related capabilities of how flooding or how potential flooding or how flood events or other things that's related to sea level rise could play out in their own given communities. And then we wanted to be able to integrate this in with a platform that not only can give you what I call an education skin of awareness around sea level rise, but then within the context of you understanding this, the question then becomes, how do I then leverage this data apparatus of being able to be participatory in the process to then not only say this is happening to us or this is happening to my community, but also say I have a role to play, right? In informing the process, not only as it relates to my personal community, but also as it relates to maybe even informing the decision-making process and even the policy-related process. I would be remiss if I didn't cite our partners at this point. In terms of the actual Sea-Rise-related education tool that you see here, we established a wonderful partnership with Rock Technologies, which is an ArcGIS company that is located in Charleston, South Carolina. I want to give a special shout out to Emma Lou Pauls, who is an incredible coder who literally was a part of our Fish Hackathon, who basically told me in a sidebar at the Fish Hackathon when we hosted at South Carolina Aquarium that she had this great app that she wanted to tell me about, and guess what? It was a great app. And then over to my left, your right, we have the two citizen science components, which is the Litter-Free Digital Journal, and we have the Sea-Rise component, which we did both of these in collaboration with the Mount Desert Biological Laboratory. We're basically, through the Anecdata platform, Dr. Jane Disney, Duncan Belly, they've been incredible partners. And the exciting thing for me is to be able to not only work with these great partners, but also to work with these great partners on the technical end and then interface with the public, which has been incredibly exciting to be a part of that process. So thank you, partners. Now, let's shift a little bit. When I started the conversation and I talked about imminent threats, and we talked about, what does this mean? How do we talk about climate change in the context of biome protection or endangered species? I want to just draw you the two red related sort of land masses. The one to the north is called Cape Allen. Cape Allen is probably one of the most critical, is one of the most critical sea turtle nesting habitats north of Cape Hatteras in Florida. On this particular island, it's not uncommon to have over 2,000 sea turtle nests in one given season, but it's a problem here. The problem that we have as it relates to Cape Allen is that it's an island that was at one time one island that's now turning into three islands. It's an island that is under siege by erosion. You do have some accretion principles, but it's more erosion than accretion. It's an island that basically, if the projections are correct, is going to be further under siege. And the critical question for all of us who are doing conservation work is, how do we not only take care of the status quo, but how do we use the best data to say, what happens over the next 40 years? What happens over the next 20 years? And if I just fast forward potentially, and again, we know the limitation of the model. So we can have a sidebar about the limitations of model. We know that a barrier island by definition is very dynamic. So we know that what the models may say is predicated on a static view of what the current topography of the land is. But basically, let's just, for the purpose of this discussion, let's just say, given the current topography, and we know it could be dynamic, but if it wasn't dynamic, what could be the scenario if we fast forward 25 to 30 years? And basically, this is Cape Allen and, with the projection of another foot of sea level rise. And the key thing here is this, is that as a conservation organization, one of the things that I've been an advocate for, at least in my organization, is that true enough, we have seen the numbers of endangered sea turtles increase over the last 10 years. And this has been the work of really a lot of great people. But the reality is, if we're not doing the work to not only use the best data to take care of sea turtles, but also to anticipate what the future may hold so that we can be better stewards as these changes occur. And in anticipating these changes, how do we sort of come up with a plan? How do we sort of anticipate these changes with a plan? And the bottom line is this. If you no longer have Cape Allen as a place for endangered sea turtles, the reality is, where can these 2,000 nests go? That's the fundamental question. And so to further sort of accentuate this point and to further sort of bring this point home is that I'm going to give you a quick orientation. This is actually on Cape Allen, and I'm going to go from top, left, my left, right, then to the bottom. You see definitely the sea turtle nesting tracks, and you see sort of the sea turtles coming on board. What you see with the pylons, the PVC pylons, that's basically them relocating these nests because of the erosion principles and because of the flooding principles. People like Sarah Dawsey, literally, and her staff, which is a limited staff from the National Fish and Wildlife, are literally having to relocate hundreds, if not thousands, of nests trying to keep them viable given the current flood-related condition and erosion principles. And what you have in the bottom depiction of the picture is Kelly Thorvaldson, as I mentioned earlier, our conservation programs manager, basically standing in front of what you see erosion principles right in front of your eyeballs. That this is the type of erosion that's going on right at Cape Island and basically is of concern. And you'll hear more from, we're going to have a clip from Sarah Dawson that we play at the end of my presentation, where she's going to be able to talk in her own words what's really going on there. But the critical piece here is knowing this, what are the options? How do we, once we know this information, what steps can be done to make sure that the 2,000 or 1,000 or whatever the number of nests that's going to be potentially displaced, that they have another place potentially that you can be an absorber or can fulfill this capacity. Now, the irony here is that the island that's depicted here is called Hilton Head Island. And I don't know how many of you have ever come to South Carolina, or maybe spent time in South Carolina, but I would tell you this, Hilton Head right now is not currently known as a bastion for conservation, right? Anybody who've had a chance to come to, it's known for being very beautiful, but it's known for being more known for its resorts and its golfing. But the other sweet irony with this is that when you look at the data, Hilton Head Island was only second in terms of sea turtle nesting, only to Cape Island. And then when you look at the data, it also has one of the largest areas in terms of beach surface area, right? So even though this is not, if you look at the traditional view of what's been going on or what's considered conservation-driven organizations or communities inside of South Carolina, that Hilton Head wouldn't jump off the page. But one of the things that we have basically been doing through looking at this data is that Hilton Head Island is one of those potential areas that could be of significance, specifically looking at these current changes. The other thing that makes Hilton Head Island of interest is that under the same 1 foot sea level rise scenario, it still is pretty intact. So even from a land topography standpoint, a land elevation standpoint, it has a resiliency principle involved where it makes it very, very interesting. And so this is sort of the thought process. How do we take this data and how do we then work with this community proactively, helping them realize that, you know what, not only are you an important economic driver in terms of tourism, in terms of resorts and golfing, you are just as important as a biome, as an ecological habitat, as a potential haven for endangered sea turtles. We just need to be able to communicate that message and get people on board with understanding that reality. Now, a key thing that I've been a proponent of, and one of the things that I've been an advocate of, is that a lot of times when we think about sea level rise, climate change, we just think about either storm surge, we think about inundation, we may even think about ocean acidification. But a lot of times we don't think about the notion of what is in the water column is going to have a broader impact. And the data that I have up here is basically through our litter-free digital journal, we've been able to sort of do our own baseline on our little like 50-pace beach, a beach that's basically right on outside of our building, about 50 paces, of the different type of marine aquatic debris that we aggregate on our small little beach. Now the irony is that basically what we didn't have any preconceived notions of what the data would say, but basically what comes out more than anything on our beach as we aggregated this data was styrofoam. Styrofoam by far was the most prevalent marine aquatic debris that we basically was able to sort of identify as a part of our baseline. But the question I always ask people is this: when you have this type of data that comes in on the everyday, what happens during a flood or inundation event? And so basically, unfortunately, I was able to ask this question, and guess what? I had a flood or inundation event that actually was able to elucidate this question. And so surprise, surprise, Irma happened, and guess what? This was basically the styrofoam that washed up literally on our back door as a part of the Irma flood inundation principle. We had 18 bags of this stuff, and it was all styrofoam. And the only point I make here is that sometimes when we think about climate change, sea level rise, and different levels of water, we don't think about what are those things in the water. We don't think about it's not just about the erosion principles, it's not about the corrosion and erosion principles. Literally, you need to be concerned about what's in the water, because basically as the water volume increases or has great impacts on the terrestrial plane, whatever's in the water is going to come out of that water column. So in my world, we cannot talk about these issues without talking about the water quality as a part of that equation, and that also involves marine aquatic debris. And so to this point, and one of the critical points I want to make here tonight, is that a big part of what we've been about is not only how do you get people to not just sort of what I call disaggregate things unnecessarily. The bottom line is this, is that as we see changes in the water, and as those water volumes increase, we're definitely going to have greater impacts on what's going to happen on the terrestrial plane, and it's not just related to just erosion, it's not just related to inundation, it's also related to what's in the water column. And those are also key points of concern, and we need to get very smart about those things as well. So let's get back to what Dave was talking about community. One of my passion points has been, how do we reach out to communities that have traditionally been not a part of this equation? And the other passion point for me is, and I told Dave and his team about this over dinner, it can't just be Al, George, and my staff of conservation experts being the proponents of this change. You have to have the people inside the communities themselves become their own champions, become their own advocates, become their own sort of people that they want to rally around. And just to give you a quick synopsis, the Mitchellville community is a very special community, and actually this is located on Hilton Head Island. The Mitchellville community is called the Freedom Park community because basically, if you know I'm a big fan of history, the Union Army staged their troops on Hilton Head Island. And because they staged their troops on Hilton Head, they staged their naval-based operations. They staged, to be more accurate, they staged their naval-based operations on Hilton Head Island. And because of the staging of their naval-based operations, that the slaves on this island were the first slaves to be freed, even before the Emancipation Proclamation. And so the Mitchellville area, or the Mitchellville Park, Freedom Park area, was the first self-governing ex-slave colony in the United States of America. Now, the unfortunate part of this is that the bottom depiction here, the Sandalwood Community Food Pantry, mind you, the people in Mitchellville and this part of Hilton Head have hundreds of years of history, but unfortunately, Reverend Dr. Nanette Pearson and the Sandalwood Community Food Pantry still feed a lot of these people descendants today. And one of the things that I basically have made a point of emphasis for our efforts is when we think about resilience and when we think about how do we engage all as a part of this discussion, a critical part for me is we got to be willing to partner with even unconventional and even untraditional partners. And my bottom line is this. You have over 800 families coming to this particular food pantries to receive their nourishment, to receive what they need to sort of make their ends meet or whatever have you from a food standpoint. Why not partner with them in terms of how to best communicate with the people that are in greatest need about these issues as well? And so a critical part of what we've been about through the Rice Initiative has not just been about technology, has not just been about how do we sort of come up with tools, it's literally how do we build these relationships with these communities, and how do we even extend sort of ourselves beyond our comfort zone and work with people who are even, believe it or not, are not scientists? How do we work with people who have direct points of contact within the communities? And if we're able to do that, then what we're able to do in the process is create this reach. What you see here to my left, you're right. I may be messing that up, but this is an example of the Isle of Palms right here immediately to my left. This is an example of how they had erosion principles as it relates to their beach. And this is just an example of the type of just through one flood event, how you can have this go from this to that. What you see on the bottom of this slide is actually one of the housing projects that's in Charleston. And this is literally what we call sunny day flooding, where basically this is just on a regular sunny day, high tide, this is their reality. They wake up to a lake of water that they have to literally find a way to navigate around. To the immediate, on top of that photo, you have a flood inundation event on a more affluent street. And then to the far left-hand corner, the upper left-hand corner, that is actually an example of Cape Island and the erosion principles that's going on there. And so the only reason why I show these diversity of photos is that in our world in which we live in South Carolina, this represents the diversity of the communities that we need to come up with solutions for. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's literally each of these communities have specific drivers, have specific needs, and as a part of our thought process, we need to be thinking critically about this. And just to bring this point home, this is called Harbor Island. What you see here in the bottom left here as a part of this, people try to install what they call wave displacement devices. The problem is with the wave displacement devices, it was under sort of review by DHEC, and the bottom line is DHEC decided that this was not appropriate, that they were not going to sanction these predicated on, they didn't have enough data in terms of adverse impacts on sea turtles and different wildlife-related features. But this picture is just put here to say that this is not an issue that's far away on a hill. Literally, this issue is at our back door, and people are trying to figure out what are the solutions. And so, as I round the bases and as we sort of come to the back end of my presentation, this is an example of Hilton at Island if the 6-foot sea level rise scenario is true. Now, the irony upon ironies, and again, I wanted just to be able to elucidate this a little bit, is that this part of the island that still has the best elevation is actually the part of the island that has the historic Mitchellville and the Gullah Geechee community. And the irony is this is sort of the community where you have the Sandalwood Community Food Pantry that's located. And because that community is there, it's low density, it's low population, it's low development. This part of Hilton at Island is actually known for being the epicenter in terms of the resort area, but guess what? Under this current potential sea level rise scenario, that's going to be potentially compromised dramatically. But the bottom line is this, and Dave and I talked about this earlier. What happened to these people? Once these people realize that this part of the island is no longer viable over the long term. But more importantly, that part of the island becomes critical not just for the preservation of the Gullah Geechee, but as we sort of highlighted through the demise of Cape Island and the demise of that critical habitat, guess what? This becomes also more important what? Sea turtle habitat. So it's not just a question of whether or not we're fighting to protect those those legacy communities and those communities that have been underserved, that literally, given the dynamic change that's projected, this becomes absolutely, we have to have a critical sea turtle nesting habitat. But the question is, what happens when people realize that this is the best part of that island, right? What do you think is going to happen? And so one of the things that I put a challenge before us, and I'm giving everybody in this room this same challenge, is that it's not just enough anymore for us to be conservation-minded people who can look at the data and interpolate the data and spit out sort of different things from that interpolation. The question is, how do we peer into this data? How do we understand the inferences of this data? And the bottom line is, what strategy are we going to sort of execute to make sure that that part of that island is not only going to be preserved for that incredible historical community of people, but also for the incredibly endangered sea turtles and the different biome-related considerations that we had before. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight here is that leveraging this type of thought process, what you see so long to plastic bags in terms of Beaufort County, using this type of thought process, what we were able to do, we were able to sort of serve as a support structure, as a scientific expert support related group to help this county, the entire Beaufort County, consider why a plastic bag ban would be good for that entire county. And as a result of that point of inference and sort of highlighting these points that I've highlighted in this presentation, they actually made that real earlier this year, where their single-use plastic bag ban is going to go into effect in October. So the whole point of me sort of raising this is that this is not just theory, that literally this is a practice. And we already shown that we can do it with a plastic-related example. The key thing that I'm excited for and the key thing that I'm advocating for is that we need to do the same thing for climate change and mitigation. And the bottom line for me is we need to think of how do we build this more resilient future together. The picture to the left is actually, you can have any sort of trailer park in America, it's going to look like an explosion goes through with any type of tornado or any type of hurricane. But my point of advocacy is that it's a lot of people in rural South Carolina, Georgia, who live in similar type housing. The bottom line for me is, why can't we imagine a different future? How do we know, the reality is Irma was initially tracked to come directly at us as a Cat 3, Cat 4. We got incredibly lucky because of the Gulf drawing it in through its warm waters that it came through our back door, but we still were flooded. But the bottom line is, it's not if it's going to happen. It's a question of when it's going to happen. And then when you factor in climate change, sea level rise, you just you create this exacerbation of elements that's going to make it even that much more worse. So there's literally an imperative for us to not only be proactive in terms of the knowledge base that we can accumulate, to be proactive in terms of understanding the data, but more importantly, to be proactive about what we can do to get out in front of this stuff so that we can actually not only mitigate the risk of endangered biomes, of critically endangered species, but also the people. And so, as my last part of this PowerPoint presentation before I show sort of some other things, we're actually going to be honored to host the Oceans 18 event that's going to happen in Charleston from October the 22nd to 25th. Dr. Jeffrey Payne from the Office of Coastal Management is actually one of the local chairs of that event. We actually have honorary chairman of our board, Jonathan Zucker. And basically, the whole impetus behind this year's Oceans 18 event is going to be coastal resilience. So if these topics are of interest, if you're interested in these topics, please join us in Charleston in October when it's not so hot and so humid. But that being said, there's two more things I want to share with you, and then I'll be done. If you can bring up the Sea Rise link, please. And basically, as soon as it comes up, what I want to just basically show you just quickly is this is an example of the Sea Rise tool, and again, you can, it's adaptive to any platform, whether it's a phone or whether it's a computer or PDA or what have you. But the bottom line is this: in a place like Savannah, one of the places we held the town halls, they don't even have this as a strategic priority. Do 1 foot of sea level rise for me. Yep, just 1 foot. Yep. Do you notice the difference? Take it back to no sea level rise. That's Savannah now, 1 foot sea level rise. Do you notice the difference? And that's, we're not talking about hundreds of years here. We're talking about literally, we can see this potentially in a 30-year, 35-year time cycle. And for them not to have this as a strategic priority in that city, I don't know what to say. And that's really been the strong thing that I feel so passionate about this work is that it's just not nice work to do. It's literally people's lives, livelihoods at stake if we don't do this work. And let's take it back to zero. Take it back to zero again. No sea level rise. And so, but look at the entire coast, this entire sort of area, and we started off talking about from Georgetown to Savannah. And that's been sort of our purview, from Georgetown to Savannah. But if you think about what is the current state of this right now, let's just do 1 foot of sea level rise. Again, do you notice a difference? Do you notice a difference? And so this is not, like I said, this is not a 100-year cycle. This is basically, we are at this point now. And the question is, what do we do to help communities, to help biomes? One of the most critical habitats in the world is the salt marsh estuary, Spontana to the Florida, that runs basically from Georgetown down to Jacksonville. 66% of that goes from basically Georgetown to Jacksonville in terms of eastern seashore related representation. I believe it's estimated something like 1/3, 75% of Atlantic pelagic species spend at least 1/3 of their life cycle in this marine estuarine habitat. Guess what? That is in play, people. That is in play if we don't have a plan for both the biome. We need to have a plan for the endangered species, but also in the world of big sea conservation, we also need to have a plan for the people. So if you could bring up the video of Sarah Dawsey, I think that would bring my presentation to an end. I just want you to be able to listen to the video. It's about an 8-minute clip from Sarah Dawsey, who is the superintendent at Cape Romaine Refuge. And we're going to let her have the last words, and I thank you for your attention.
Well, the refuge is about 66,000 acres. It's located to the north of Charleston. It's a barrier island refuge and an estuarine refuge, so it's only accessible by boat. The refuge is very important for a number of species, sea turtles specifically, and it was founded for migratory birds, so it's very important for shorebirds and seabirds. So the barrier islands of the refuge support a lot of species, and we manage to protect those species and keep them going. Well, we're seeing a tremendous loss of habitat. Climate change is one of the biggest factors in that. There are other man-made factors, such as the Santee River Dam that was put in 45. But since that time, the barrier islands have lost a lot of habitat. We've lost over 2,000 acres of front beach habitat on Cape Remain. This is impacting our nesting birds. The seabirds and the shorebirds nest right on the ground. Overwash of these nests and loss of habitat is causing failure, repeated failure of these birds. Our nest, our sea turtle nest, we have to move so they don't wash away. Well, we're working right now with USGS, U.S. Geological Survey. We're doing a study. We're looking at the footprint of Cape Remain in the past, what it is now, and what it's projected to be in the future with climate change. And we're working with the stakeholders in the area to see what exactly the impacts are going to be to the refuge itself and to the species and the habitat, but we're trying to tie that into the local community as well. We're trying to help the local community understand the importance of the refuge and what the refuge provides for the people of the Charleston and surrounding areas, such as shellfish and recreational finfish and subsistence fishing and all those things that people don't really think about.
Giving you time to think. Dave, I told you my track record with technology. I joked about this earlier. Yeah. And if we can't get it run basically in a nutshell, what Sarah was basically communicating is basically the data that you saw. And I just want to thank you for your attention. I apologize to Sarah Dawson. Yeah. Well, okay. As I said, my track record with technology. Continue if we can't continue.
And all those things that people don't really think about that's available, but it's there and it's disappearing. Clean water, the air quality, all of it is very important to humans in the community. And we really want people to understand that going forward. Well, I think I'd like people to understand just the importance that it plays in the, not only just the natural history of the area, but the economy. I think people don't understand how much we rely on that natural resource. We're looking at trying to establish migratory pathways into the future. We're trying to connect protected areas such as the Francis Marion National Forest and the Cape Remain National Wildlife Refuge. We are right next to each other, but we have Highway 17 corridor and development coming up. As this habitat's lost, we're losing not just the habitat, but the species also. And we need to be able to have habitat available in the future. So we're trying to protect areas and connect protected areas into the future so species can migrate and so that those resources will be available in the future. We've seen some new species come in. Roseate spoonbill is one bird that we see quite frequently now that we hadn't seen in the past. White pelicans are another. We don't have that many, but they're present year-round. We also have invasive species, unfortunately. Phragmites is a plant that gets into the wetland areas of the refuge. It's quite common in South Carolina now. We put a lot of effort into trying to eliminate it. Chinese tallow is another plant that is competing with our maritime forest. We put a lot of effort into trying to get rid of that as well. We also have, on our refuges inland, we see that the freshwater communities are dying as the salt water is penetrating up in the Waccamaw River, up into the Edisto River. You're seeing die-off of those freshwater trees, and you're seeing that transition already start. It's very alarming, just the loss of 2,000 acres in our refuges. truly alarming to me. I've been there for a long time, and it's very sad. It's like losing an old friend. And that's why we really can't stop it, unfortunately. I wish I could. I wish I could stop the erosion that's happening, but I can't. What we're trying to do is just kind of ensure there's habitat moving forward. And as that habitat's available and transitions into different types of habitat, be it salt marsh or maritime forest or bottomland hardwood forest, the species hopefully will find that habitat and be able to utilize it. We don't know yet whether if the salt marsh will be able to keep pace with the rising sea levels, if the habitat will transition quickly enough so that species can use it. We don't know that yet. But all we can do is protect the habitat and hope that it appears as needed. We are actually working on that right now. We've had some projections, the SLAM model, sea levels affecting marsh modeling, but that was very generic. It had kind of coarse elevations throughout, so it's not as accurate as it can be. So we're working with USGS right now. We're doing that, looking at the footprint of Cape Remain, the surrounding areas, and looking at sea level rise into the future. So that's something that we'll have in the next couple of years. Well, I think the other populations, other than human populations, tie directly back to human populations. And I think that's really the message I want to get across to people, is that the health of our environment, the health of the other species that inhabit this earth, tie directly to the health of human beings. We're not outside and all by ourselves in this world. Our health depends on the health of the earth. And the health of the earth can be, it's an indicator when you see species that we have, such as seabirds or shorebirds or sea turtles, dying out, species becoming extinct. That's an indicator that we're not just hurting that species, but we're hurting ourselves in the long run.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And thank you for all the great work here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Thank you.
All right, if we could bring the lights up a little bit, and we have a little bit of time for some questions.
I thought I was off.
Questions over here. Oh, and we are still live, so we're going to do questions and comments on microphone.
Okay.
When was that video made where she was talking, and is she still able to discuss these impacts in an open way?
Yeah, well, the video was made as a part of the town hall framework. And so if you're interested in, we have like over 24 hours of footage or some ridiculous amount of footage that's on that, but it's the Sea Change, SETV Sea Change. And basically what you just saw there was one of potentially, 10, 30, 40 interviews. And basically, we use the individual interviews as a part of the conduit to make the national sea change documentary, but also the four specific, site-specific documentaries. But also, one of the key things that we wanted to do as a part of this process is how do we capture this diversity of voices that's experiencing this phenomenon in a different way. And so, literally, that was Sarah Dawsey maybe 2 years ago, and she's still there. She's still fighting the good fight. She's an incredible woman, and I have a great deal of admiration for her. So, yes, it's literally within the last 2 years that has been done. And since then, she has been working with the USGS. Kelly Thorverson from our team has participated in that endeavor, and they're working real hard to try to figure out what's the plan for Cape Remain Refuge given these projected changes.
Cool. Another question. We'll go Jenny, and then we'll come across.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more information about the citizen science component and how people were actually collecting data to help contextualize sea level rise, and if there were any barriers in terms of getting technology into people's hands and teaching them how to use that technology.
Yeah, well, we talked about this a little bit over dinner. the first step in the process was just establishing a rapport with the communities. You know, we didn't want to come in with a preconceived notion of what the problems were or what the problems are. And once the rapport was established, we then say, well, how do we help people really get a firm grasp on what could this mean for them? And so when we first turned on the Sea-Rise viewer, it was not going to be turned on as a citizen science apparatus. It was literally just going to be informative and educational. And so that was going to be the first step. But basically, if you just want to quickly ascertain what would be the emphasis for you and your family and your community for this level of sea level rise, we just want you to be able to have that information. And just as a footnote, our sea level rise viewer is built on the same data, same NOAA LIDAR data as Digital Coast. It's the same data that's being used by them. The only difference is it's just adaptive to any platform. And then just recently, what we have done, we have recently turned on at least the sea level rise citizen science component pieces. And so as a part of the reach back out with the site-specific screenings, we're now making people aware that you now have this additional functionality that you can then have as a part of your toolkit. And as I mentioned over dinner tonight, I'm very excited because one of the legacy communities that came to our Charleston event, they're going to actually be at the South Carolina Aquarium this Saturday, fulfilling that call for them to be fully trained on the Sea-Rise related component of the citizen science piece. The irony, so on the Sea-Rise piece, we literally have just turned it on. On the Litter-Free Digital Journal piece, because there was just more of an awareness around litter and aquatic debris, that has taken off like a water rocket, you know, like a soda bottle rocket or whatever the rocket is. I can't recollect it at this point. But, and to that point, I mean, we have already, and just literally by word of mouth, we've been able to collect over 138,000 pieces of marine aquatic debris and properly dispose of it over the last year with just 230 volunteers. To put that in perspective, I think it's only like in the city of Charleston proper, there's only 137,000 people. So with just a committed group of volunteers, we've been able to collect a piece of aquatic debris and properly dispose of it greater than the number of people who live in Charleston proper. And then an unexpected outcome of that has been with this greater awareness and empowerment, you've had at least 9 communities inside of South Carolina pass their version of a single-use plastic bag ordinance. And the citizen science data and the sea turtle data has been a part of that equation.
I want to thank you. Your lecture was quite informative.
Thank you.
The danger to the sea turtles is more than heartbreaking and concerning.
Yeah.
In terms of plastic, but I was wondering when you mentioned about the health effect on people,
Yeah.
I didn't see actually languaging about that health effect because unfortunately some people I think would be more involved in trying to make a difference if they realize the health effect on humans. I mean, all life is important.
Correct.
So I want to have you address that. And looking at the areas that has so much more land,
Yeah.
is there a potential of some of that land being transferred to the areas that are at risk with higher sea levels? And with all kinds of construction, like where is that land going?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that's something that's being looked into. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for your excellent question. One of the key things that I felt when we started this journey, to the point you just raised, given the concern around human health issues, was to really have the right partner. And that's why we actually had the Medical University of South Carolina, the Public Information and Community Outreach Office, as literally they were the spearhead of this in terms of, really syncing it with that community health and that human health component. And the good news is that my colleague and my mentor, Dr. David Rivers, who runs that office, he is just as passionate, even more so than I am, about these issues. And he has been a proponent of how do we elevate this. I sort of stayed in my swim lane tonight just talking about biomes and turtles, but rest assured that with us having that partnership with Medical University of South Carolina and with Dr. David Rivers, his whole bellywick is this point. He is a proponent of, we have to think about not just the heat-related conditions, the particulate matter, air quality, We have to think about vector-borne diseases as we go from a subtropical to more of a tropical related community. There are psychological things about post-traumatic stress that people don't even talk about for people who survive all these dramatic flood events. So with that being said, definitely just duly note that it is absolutely a critical issue, and I totally agree with you that we need to elevate it. But if, David, if you're watching this tonight, I'm challenging you, we're already doing it, let's think about how we do it to a higher level. And I just want to say thank you, because basically it was through him supporting and believing in the vision of how we were able to make this vision real. So thank you, Dr. David Rivers and Medical University of South Carolina, for supporting and being the spearhead behind this.
All right, we have a question, real quick question, one last one, Elliot.
This is kind of a personal question. As conservationists, we hear a lot of statistics, and we really take those pretty heavy because we're all involved and concerned about this. What keeps you going? What are your short-term wins that really build you up, and what's your long-term vision that really keeps you in the game and keeps you doing this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that great question, and thank you for allowing me to come back to what I consider to be my center. You know, when I was growing up, my motivation to get additional education was to be able to come back and help home. It wasn't to make millions of dollars. It wasn't to do all these other things. And so what I tell people all the time, we're fighting for home, you know. And another thing that I get very excited about is the opportunity to engage people in a meaningful way and to communicate in a way that let's talk about how do we keep you and your family safe. And I mentioned, you know, we talked about Miss Marilyn Glover, who is from the 10 Mile community, and one of my favorite tongue-in-cheek moments was, I think it was Matthew at the time, was coming, and I called Miss Glover up, and I said, Miss Glover, hopefully you're not at home. And she said, yes, I am still at home. And I said, Miss Glover, you need to get the Hades out of there, you know? And as simple as that may sound, that's one of the wins. The fact that I could pick up a phone and I could call a woman in that community and I could say, are y'all safe? Are y'all safe? And so to me, those are the things that motivate me. Or I could have a Dr. Emery Campbell from Hilton Head, or I could have a Ramsey Hotem Collody from Savannah, or I can have a Reverend Dr. Nanette Pearson from the historic Mitchellville community, and all these people are on my speed dial. And I love and I'm concerned about each and every one of them. And so, you know, in addition to us shutting down and getting our facility ready for a storm, part of my process is literally calling all these people that are now part of my community, my extended community of family. So that's what motivates me. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, that was great way to end this. Make sure everybody, we have another lecture on June 12th with Dominique Rizzolo, and she'll be here to discuss developing new tools and documentation methods for cultural heritage research at underwater sites. Remember, if you can't come here in person, you can always see the live stream at aquariumofthepacific.org. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.